Welcome to this very special program from the Gross Family Center for the Study of Antisemitism and the Holocaust. This is Jordan Schachtel, and I'm an advisory board member of the center. It is my privilege to introduce our speaker today. Ariel Berger is the founding director and senior scholar of the Witness Institute, a new project empowering emerging leaders inspired by the life and legacy of Elie Wiesel. Dr. Berger is an author, artist, and teacher whose work integrates spirituality, the arts, and strategies for social change. An ordained rabbi, Ariel received his PhD in Jewish Studies and Conflict Resolution under Elie Wiesel. A lifelong student of Professor Wiesel, Ariel served as his teaching fellow from 2003 to 2008, after which he directed education initiatives at Combined Jewish Philanthropies of Greater Boston. As a Covenant Foundation grantee, Ariel develops cutting-edge arts and educational programming for adults, facilitates workshops for educators, consults nonprofits, and serves as a scholar, artist in residence for institutions around the United States. In 2018, Ariel wrote his National Jewish Book Award winner, Witness, Lessons from Elie Wiesel's Classroom. With this book, Dr. Berger, devoted protege and friend, takes us into the sacred space of Wiesel's classroom. Please welcome Dr. Ariel Berger.
Greetings. It's a pleasure to share some words with you and some questions we're facing together as a society today, and questions that Professor Elie Wiesel dealt with all of his life. We're dealing with questions today that we thought were long resolved, about the nature of hatred, about the nature of otherness, about the rise in antisemitism and racism and other forms of hatred, and how best to fight those forms of hatred. We have questions about how to restore our ability to disagree well, something we seem to have increasingly lost, and how to maintain our joy and resilience in the face of all of these challenges. And if I am preoccupied by these kinds of questions, it is in large part because of the presence in my life of my great teacher, Elie Wiesel. I met Professor Wiesel, as some of you may know, when I was a teenager. I was a questing young person, asking many questions about the relationship between my very Orthodox Jewish upbringing and the complexity of my family and the role of creativity in traditional Jewish life. And I remember that my soon-to-be stepfather took me to a lecture in New York at the 92nd Street Y, where Elie Wiesel, the great Nobel laureate, was giving a lecture on King Solomon and his sons. I don't remember much of the lecture because I was nervous. I knew that I was going to be introduced to Professor Wiesel after the lecture, and I was thinking about that for much of the lecture, I think. And so I can't tell you much of what he said, but we can actually watch that lecture now on the 92nd Street Y website, which has a wonderful legacy archive of Professor Wiesel's lectures over many, many years. But what I do remember is that after the lecture, we moved into a small reception room where he was waiting, and there was a line of people gathered to say hello to him. And I remember that when it was my turn at the head of the line, and it was my chance to say hello to the great man, he held his hand out to me, and he said his name as if I had no idea who he was, with great modesty. And then he said something else, which I didn't realize at the time would change my life. He said, "Come and visit me and bring a question." It took me several months to build what some of the Hasidic masters called holy chutzpah, the holy chutzpah to actually take him up on his offer. But I did eventually. And after several months, I arrived at his home, and I brought not only one question, but many questions about life, about myself, about Judaism, about Jewish texts, Jewish history, the state of the world today, and many questions about how a young person can make choices that can lead to a better world. And he responded to my questions with great sensitivity and generosity. He made a lot of time for me. He told me to come back, and thus began a series of visits. I noticed something after a little while, though. I noticed that he never answered a single one of my questions. He always responded to my questions with another question or a story or a prodding insight. And much later, I would learn one of the most important lessons I learned from Professor Wiesel, which is that there is an important difference between an answer and a response. An answer closes conversation. It resolves and ends conversation, while a response opens up new possibilities. And as I would learn, Professor Wiesel was someone who really celebrated questions and preferred questions to answers, as we shall see. But there was one question I didn't ask him in those series of conversations because it felt too personal. And the question was a question that was on my mind after reading Night, which I'm sure you've all read. And the question was, Professor, how did you go from that experience of the kingdom of night, that darkness, that loss of family, that loss of hope, the destruction of your entire pre-world Jewish community, and so many other communities, and so many Jewish children? How did you go from that experience to being the person I'm getting to know today? A person of great joy and humor and love of life. That was the question I wanted to ask, but did not. And I had to wait several years to hear his response to that question. And I heard his response to that question when I was a student at Boston University several years later in Professor Wiesel's class. And on the last day of class, he would open the floor to questions from students on any subject. And a student in the back of the room raised her hand and asked this question. And I thought to myself that this is an important question for those of us who have read Night, who have been influenced or wounded or impacted by Night. Because the question really is, what happened on the day after? What happened on the page after the last page of Night? So the student asked her question, how did you keep going? How did you become this person of joy that we see before us today? And Professor Wiesel said the following. He said, if you ask me how I survived, I cannot tell you. I have no idea. There were others who were stronger than I. There were others who were better connected to the capos and the authorities in the camps than I, or who knew how to bribe them in ways that I didn't know how to do. And there were perhaps even others who had a greater will to live by the end of the experience than I. I was weak. I was thin. Even before the war, I don't know how I survived. But if you're asking me, how did I keep my sanity after the war? How did I keep going after the war? And how did I keep my hope alive after the war? Well, that's easy. He said, it was my love of learning that saved me. And then he told us the following story. He said, on the day after liberation from Buchenwald, when the international aid organizations and the American military had gathered all the young people, all the children, the orphans of the camp, before they were going to be sent to various orphanages in France and Switzerland primarily, they gathered us children and they asked us, is there anything we can give you or get for you or find for you to make your life a little bit better after the experiences, the unimaginable experiences that you've been through? And Professor Wiesel told us in the classroom, he said, I remember a young woman asked for chocolate because she hadn't eaten chocolate in many years and she wanted to know if she remembered the taste accurately. And he said, I remember a young boy asked for a sweater or a jacket because he was cold and he had been cold for the last 3.5 years. He said, but I asked for something different. I asked for the same volume of Talmud, the great compendium of Jewish law and legend that I was studying before the war, so that I could continue my studies at the exact same line and the exact same word where my studies were interrupted by the Nazi invasion of my hometown. And that is what saved me, my love of learning and the return to learning. Now, this was very typical for Professor Wiesel. He indeed was a person of great joy and humor and love of life, and especially love of learning. He studied every day. In addition to his preparation for class as a teacher, as a professor, he had a course of study in Talmud every day and in other sacred texts and in other world literature and wisdom traditions. And this really was a source of great joy and hope for him. So I didn't ask him the question, but I got to hear the answer years later. And I got to experience his love of learning in his classroom at Boston University, where he taught for almost 40 years. Professor Wiesel taught a course at Boston University called Literature of Memory. That was the headline of the course. Each year, the particular class title was different. Literature of Memory, Exile in Ancient and Modern Literature. Literature of Memory, Hidden and Banned Books. Literature of Memory, Literary Responses to Oppression. And on and on and on. And he never repeated a course. But all of his courses were designed in an interdisciplinary way through the study of literature to sensitize students and to guide them through a course in moral education, moral transformation, to consider some of the great enduring questions posed to us by the experience of the Holocaust. You have to understand, before I say anything else, that the setting of Elie Wiesel's classroom was very unique. He had students from all around the world, many of whom were grandchildren of survivors, some earlier children of survivors, some of whom had experienced various forms of oppression or conflict in different parts of the world, in Latin America, in Africa, in the Far East. And many of the students carried burdens of history. And I remember, and I wrote about in my book, a student who was not the granddaughter of survivors, but was the granddaughter of an SS officer. And she came to Professor Wiesel looking for a way to make meaning of her family legacy. She met him in Germany when he was visiting Germany, and she approached him after a conference and said, "Professor, I'm a granddaughter of an SS officer. What do I do with my family name? Should I change my name? And how do I carry this burden? How do I carry this memory?" And he said, in my tradition, in the Jewish tradition, we do not believe in collective guilt. But you do have a responsibility to turn your suffering into a blessing for others. And then he said to her, as he said to many others, "Come and study with me in Boston." And she did for many, many years. So the classroom was filled with students who were carrying tremendous burdens, very atypical burdens and questions and traumas and concerns. And yet this was a university classroom, very rigorous, filled with a lot of reading, a book a week, a novel or a play usually. If it was a Russian novel, sometimes he would spread it out over 2 weeks. If it was a novel like Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman, which is a very long, powerful novel, it would be over 2 weeks, but a lot of reading, a lot of writing, and a lot of discussion. And at the beginning of Professor Wiesel's teaching, every semester, he would give a little speech that went something like this. He would say, "I want you to know that I will learn as much from you as you will learn from me." And he would go on and say, "The only person in this room you are allowed to interrupt is me. You're not allowed to interrupt one another." He had a deep regard for his students. He had a deep sense of belief in the process of education, in the relationship between teachers and students, and in creating an environment of deep hospitality to students' questions. There was no such thing as a stupid question in Professor Wiesel's classroom. There were questions that seemed at first to be off point or off kilter, but he would always find a way to tease out meaning from the question and reveal the question behind the question that was a contribution to the class as a whole. As he would teach us, one of the first rules of moral living is never allow anyone to be humiliated in your presence. And so his classroom was a space in which every student could bring his or her own questions, challenges, personal concerns. And there was some magical alchemy in the relationship between the literature we studied, whether it was Sophocles or Shakespeare or Virginia Woolf or Kafka or Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, and Professor Wiesel's own life and history and experience and current experiences as a human rights activist, a Nobel laureate, and a confidant of presidents and prime ministers, and the students' own lived questions. Those were the ingredients in which his classroom was steeped in such a way to create an environment for moral transformation. So I entered Professor Wiesel's classroom as an undergraduate student at Boston University with one goal in mind. Even though I had spent time with Professor Wiesel at that point, I was very shy. And my goal for the semester was to go completely unnoticed in the classroom. And I sat in the corner and hoped that Professor Wiesel would not call on me. And I almost succeeded. But towards the end of the semester, he asked a question and he looked at me and he waited a very long time. And so I had no choice but to say the word that was in my mind in response to his question. And the word was authenticity. And he smiled and nodded and he said, exactly. And a week later, he asked me to become his teaching assistant the following year for his next course. And so I often tell groups when I speak to groups, if you're ever looking to open a gate, if you're looking to get a job or raise money or ask someone out on a date, try to sneak in the word authenticity. It seems to work really well. I felt that it was a magic word. I felt that I didn't deserve this honor. And in fact, I declined the invitation. I wrote a letter to Professor Wiesel explaining that I was already planning on traveling to Israel to study in yeshiva, to study our traditional Jewish texts, to become more acquainted with my own tradition and the tools and methodologies of studying those texts, and that I felt I needed to do that before I could really contribute anything to his classroom. And I wrote him the letter and sent it, and a few days later I called him at home, and he answered the phone, and I said, Professor, did you get my letter? He said, I did. I said, and? He said, you know how much I care about learning, and I celebrate learning, and I celebrate your decision to go and study. And then he added something which took me a long time to believe that he meant, but he really did. He said, I'll wait for you. I'll wait for you. And he did. And 7 years later, when I'd finished a course of study in Israel, I went to visit Professor Wiesel, and I was looking at different career opportunities. And he said, why are you looking at any of those opportunities? I told you I'd wait for you. Come and study with me at Boston University, do your PhD with me, become my teaching assistant. And so I did. And in 2003, I entered Professor Wiesel's classroom as a graduate student and as his teaching assistant. And thus began the real focused time that I spent in his classroom, watching as he transformed the lives and the destinies of students of all ages and from many parts of the world. And as I sat there in his classroom, I started noticing that he was asking many questions. And there were certain themes that he came back to over and over again. And there was a certain kind of consistency and variety in his course of moral education. And I started paying attention not only to the content of what he was saying, but to the methodologies, the pedagogies he was using to inspire, provoke, and activate students to become moral change agents. And for all of you educators, you know that the power of education lies in great content, depth and substantive content, as well as creative and powerful, effective pedagogy. And so I spent the next 5 years paying attention to Professor Wiesel's pedagogy and his approach to moral education. And I want to share with you some of the things that I saw there and some of the things that I learned. But first, in order to understand the question that I think lies at the heart of his project as an educator, I want to share with you a story. And this is a story that was told to me by my son, who was studying in Israel on a program called the Alexander Muss High School program in Israel, where they spend a semester studying in Israel, but they travel to Poland for about 10 days in order to experience the history of pre-war Jewish life in Europe, as well as the history of the Holocaust. Now, my son had a best friend on the program. And when the group arrived in Poland, after a few days, my son's friend, whose name is Mason, disappeared for a day or two with one of the counselors and didn't tell anyone where he was going. And then he reappeared, he came back, and he wouldn't talk about where he had been. And this was when the program was visiting Warsaw. And so the teenagers had been traveling and hearing about the Warsaw Ghetto and the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. They traveled to the Polish marketplace where they saw the anti-Semitic statues that are sold, the tchotchkes that are images of Jews with coins that are sold to this day in Polish marketplaces. And they were learning about contemporary Polish life. And when Mason came back, he wouldn't tell anyone where he had been. But after a day or so, he told my son, because they were best friends, and I think because my son nudged him a lot. And this is what Mason told my son. He said, you know, my great-grandparents were survivors. They were married just a few weeks before the deportation to another camp on their way. Eventually, they were transported to Auschwitz. And when they arrived at the camp as newlyweds, the first camp, my great-grandfather would meet my great-grandmother at the fence separating the men's and women's sides of the camp when he could sneak away, which in that camp was possible. And he would bring her an extra piece of bread or a potato, and they would have a moment together before they had to sneak back to the barracks. And this went on until my great-grandmother was transferred from the main camp they were transferred to Auschwitz, and she was transferred to a rabbit farm on the outskirts of Auschwitz. The Nazis had a rabbit farm for two reasons, as I understand from historians of the subject. One was they wanted fur for uniforms, and the other was they were experimenting on the rabbits to look for a cure for typhus, because typhus was decimating many of the Nazi officers in the field. So Mason continued, my great-grandmother was transferred to this rabbit farm to be a worker, a slave laborer on the rabbit farm. The rabbit farm was run by a young Polish man who recognized very quickly that the rabbits on the rabbit farm were receiving better and more food than the Jewish prisoners. He started sneaking food to the Jewish slave laborers under his watch. He was caught, he was beaten by the Nazis. He continued to sneak food into them. And this went on for some time until, Mason continued, my great-grandmother cut her arm on a fence, on a rusty fence. And the cut became infected. And she was facing a serious, mortal infection. Now, it wasn't a serious infection at all if you had access to antibiotics. But of course, Jews in that time and place did not. And the cut became infected. Her life was in grave danger. She was close to death. What did the Polish young manager of the rabbit farm do when he saw this? He cut his arm on a fence that was rusty. He placed his wound on her cut, so that he would receive the infection that she had. He indeed became infected. He waited for the infection to grow a bit, and then he went to the Nazis and he said, look, I'm one of your most productive managers. If I die, you're going to lose a lot of productivity from this rabbit farm. I need medicine. I need antibiotics. And they gave him antibiotics. He wasn't a Jew. He shared the antibiotics with her, and he saved her life. So Mason said to my son, do you know where I was when I left the program? This Polish man is still alive. He lives on the outskirts of Warsaw. And I went to visit him and to say, thank you for my life. Thank you for my life. Now, we've heard stories of the righteous among the nations. And this story and many other stories raise questions for us. What kind of person makes a choice that pushes against everything they are being told and everything they are being forced to do to dehumanize another group of people? What kind of moral courage does it take? What kind of empathy? What kind of sensitivity does it take to share the wound of another? So many did not. But this man, Mr. Misiunik was his name, did. How did he get there? How did he become the kind of person who would do such a thing? This is the question behind all of Professor Elie Wiesel's life and role as an educator, because his goal was to turn out students who would make those kinds of difficult choices, hopefully never in the same extreme conditions or situations, but even in more modest ways, students who would be witnesses, in his words. What is a witness? A witness is the opposite of a spectator. A spectator sees human suffering and it feels distant and unrelated to the spectator. And so he looks away quite easily and goes about his business. The witness cannot do that. The witness feels implicated in events. The witness takes things personally and feels that the suffering of another implicates me, and I have to do something. I have to find some way not to answer, but to respond. That was his goal. And he would say, my goal for you, students, is to sensitize you. Everything we learn needs to sensitize us. His hope, and it's astonishing that he had hope at all after what he went through, but he taught us that hope is a moral choice. It's the first moral choice. To reject despair allows you to make more and more other moral choices. Hope is a choice. He would quote Albert Camus, who said, when there is no hope, we must create it. His hope for his students was that his students would go out into the world and bring sensitivity and kindness and compassion and a sense of responsibility out into the world wherever they went. And he used literature and questions to get there. So his classroom was a place of sensitization. And he believed very deeply that the ingredient in education that allows for such sensitization to happen, that allows for such moral activation to happen, is something he called memory. And when he said the word memory, and if you ever heard Elie Wiesel speak in person or at a lecture, online, or anything, you know that he talked about memory. And when you heard the word memory in his voice, you heard that it had a capital M. Memory was a sacred word to him, as it must be for us. But what is memory? So for Professor Wiesel, memory is, number one, the transmission of information, of knowledge about the past. And that's obvious for any of us who care about the past, who care about the memory of the Holocaust in particular, who care about the state of the world today. We know, and it's even become a cliche in many places, that to forget the past is to repeat it. And we know that today, the memory of the Holocaust has been compromised. Memory is an endangered species. We know that from one study that 23% of young people in this country couldn't explain what the Holocaust was, and 60% couldn't identify the word Auschwitz. And there are many studies that confirm that young people in particular are struggling with the memory, don't have access to, have lost the memory of the Holocaust. And this kind of amnesia threatens all of us, not only Jews, but the world. So memory means the transmission of information and knowledge, but it means more than that. It also means, in Professor Wiesel's lexicon, it means the empathic encounter with stories that change us. It means the experience of hearing a story like the one I told you a few minutes ago from my son's friend Mason. A story that when I heard it from my son, I felt something change in me. I felt something in my nervous system shift subtly. I felt something in my heart, in my mind, in my body change. And I knew that I would carry that story with me wherever I go. And as a result of carrying that story, it's some percentage likelier that when faced with a moral choice, I will do the right and difficult thing. It's more likely that I will do the right thing. It's less likely that I will turn away from someone in need because I carry that story. And if I carry, it's even more likely that I will do the right thing. And so the job of an educator is to transmit memory in such a way that students will carry the stories that will allow them, that will force them, that will obligate them, that will sensitize them, that will awaken them to the possibility of their own role and their own power as moral agents in the world, not necessarily at the largest scale, at a global scale, or in extreme situations, but even in small ways. When you're walking down the street, do you notice the homeless person who's hungry? Do you stop and offer food, money, or a smile? Do you notice the person, even perhaps in your own family, who hasn't received a phone call for too long? Do you notice the person in the conversation or in the group who is isolated or marginalized? Do you notice the oppressed group in your community who are not getting the services that they need? And are you going to speak up, stand up, and do something? Or are you going to recede into the background, into indifference, which for Elie Wiesel is even worse than hatred? So in Professor Wiesel's classroom, the emphasis was on memory, which is why his courses were always called Literature of Memory. And within that headline, within that meta theme, he focused on many other themes. And I want to just share a little bit about three of them. I want to speak briefly about three of his obsessions, his preoccupations in his 40 years as an educator, and also in his writing and his public activities as a human rights activist. He was obsessed with language. He was obsessed with the power of language. He was sensitized very deeply to language and its potential misuses. He taught us that after the Holocaust, there are certain words we cannot say without shivering. Words like oven, words like fire, words like selection. I might overhear someone using that word, selection, in a grocery store. Part of me knows that it meant something very different in another time and place. And this means that language itself can harbor multiple layers of meaning and shadows and echoes. And we must be sensitized to the power of language and the way that language can be misused. And so Professor Wiesel pointed out as well that the Nazis, as we know, created their own way of speaking about radical evil. They didn't call it murder. They called it the final solution. Solution to what? To a problem that, of course, we all share. The problem of the Jews, the fact that there are Jews in the world. We've created a solution to this. This laundering of language, or as Orwell put it, the prostitution of language, is something that continues to this day. We need to be very thoughtful and careful about how we use language and how we hear language in media and from leaders and on social media. And Professor Wiesel said, because of this, and because of the dangers of language and the limits of language, it was very difficult for me to write my book, my first book, Night. And he told us that he wrote, and we know it's a matter of public record, Professor Wiesel wrote Night first as an 800-something page volume in Yiddish, titled first, And the World Remains Silent. And then he pared it down and cut and edited until we end with the slim volume we have today, 112, 113 pages, Night as we know it. And I once asked him privately, why did you write it that way? Why did you have to write it that way? And he said, Ariel, you're a painter, so you know that when you paint, you add layers of color to a canvas. But writing for me is not like painting. Writing for me is like sculpture, where the sculptor sees or imagines the image hiding within the rock, within the stone, and chips away the excess to reveal that image. That's what writing is for me. There was only one way I could write Night, he said, and that was through a process of subtraction. And then he added, do you think that the words I removed are not there? They are still there. You can feel them. And I thought, when he said that, I thought, you can feel them like we can feel the presence of the absence of all the souls who were taken from us. Their absence is still with us, whether we are aware of it or not. It shapes our lives. It shapes our Jewish lives. It shapes our Jewish community, and it must shape our Jewish destiny and our human world destiny. So language was his first preoccupation, and there were times in the classroom when he felt that he had reached the limits of language, and there was no way to explore or convey the idea that he was trying to convey anymore. And so he would stop speaking and he would start singing. This only happened a handful of times when I was his teaching assistant at Boston University. But I've spoken to students who were with him over many more years. And indeed, there were moments throughout his teaching career where he would stop and he would sing. And you can find video of Professor Wiesel singing online. There's one video on YouTube of him singing to a classroom of children in Washington, D.C. It's very beautiful. And of course, this was a way of going beyond the limits of language into song, sometimes into silence, sometimes into laughter. And it's important to say that although Professor Wiesel's classroom was all about memory and moral transformation, don't think that it was a somber place. It was a serious place, but it was also filled with laughter. And he would tell jokes. And when a student asked a good question, he would say, "You get an A++ right away." And he would laugh when someone said something funny. He had a great sense of joy and celebration. And this itself was built into his experience of learning. And in fact, it started when he was young. When he was young, he told us he came home from school one day and he said to his mother, "Mama, Sarah's pregnant." And she said, "Which Sarah?" thinking he was talking about one of the neighbors. And he said, "Sarah and Abraham, Sarah and Abraham. In the Bible, she's 99 years old, but she's going to have a baby." He couldn't believe it. He was so excited. And he maintained that sense of childlike wonder in relation to texts, to stories, to other people until the end of his life. When he was a child, he was also a child of great faith. And faith was his second preoccupation that I want to share with you briefly. We know that Elie Wiesel wrestled with questions of faith after the Holocaust. Many people misunderstood his writing in Night to believe that he had let go of any relationship with God, but he always insisted that he didn't. He maintained his relationship, but it was a relationship of wrestling. And the simple faith of his childhood gave way, was shattered in the Holocaust, and gave way to a much more complex faith, what he called a wounded faith. And he taught us and showed us and demonstrated for us students, Jews, Christians, and many others, that it's possible to live a life of faith together with questions, together with doubts. And this was the subject of many of my conversations with him. When I was 18, 19, 20 years old, I was wrestling with a lot of questions, a lot of doubts. And he was the person who allowed me, in through many private conversations, to hold on to the journey of faith, an exploration of faith, together with all of the questions and all of the doubts that I had, which paled in comparison to his questions and his doubts. And to the end of his life, he held this position. It's possible to have faith and celebrate faith with questions, with doubts. In fact, questions can be the highest expression of faith, because when you challenge God, when you ask questions, difficult questions like, "God, why did you allow such things to happen?" You are challenging God on the basis of a deeper faith that there must be some kind of response. Professor Wiesel would say, "Why do I believe? Because if I didn't believe, I would have no problem. Because I have faith, I have a problem. I have to wrestle more." And as we know, Professor Wiesel was someone who rejected superficiality. As he said to me once when I was 19, superficiality is the enemy of everything. He sought the depths. He sought depth. He sought to problematize things, and therefore he sought faith. But he managed with that to live a proudly and deeply Jewish life, studying Talmud every day and putting on tefillin, phylacteries, and celebrating Shabbat. And he would tell us, we must not let the enemy define us. We are children of Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Rachel and Leah. That's who we are as Jews. So we must fight evil fiercely and aggressively, but not allow that fight to define us. Let's not forget our sources, our roots in joy, in celebration. And the third preoccupation was protest. And he often told us a story from Jewish legend about a man who could be seen at the gates of the biblical city of Sodom in biblical times, carrying a sign and shouting at everyone to repent over many, many years. But nothing really changed. And finally, a young child walked up to this man and said, "I don't understand. You've been here for so long protesting and nothing has changed. Why has nothing changed? Why are you doing this? Why do you still protest?" And the man said, "If I protest, it is not to change society. It is not to change them. It is only so that they do not change me." And Professor Wiesel taught us that if nothing else, we must raise our voices in protest so that the injustices of the world do not change us, do not render us indifferent, slowly, apathetic over time, which is a fate worse than death. And indifference, as he taught us, is worse than hatred. He taught us we must fight hatred quickly, aggressively. When we see the first signs of it, he said it's like a cancer. It grows if you don't fight it right away. He told us to fight and call out anti-Semitism and racism. He told us we have to be very careful to unmask evil and to name it correctly and accurately so that it does not walk amongst us hidden. And he would ask us 3 questions as a teacher throughout his teaching. He would come back to these 3 questions. The first was, where is God in all that? Where is God? We must wrestle with the question of faith. We must wrestle with the theological dimensions of existence, the absolute questions as they relate to the current realities of our world. The second question, where is Mephistopheles? Where is evil hiding amongst us? Where is evil wearing a mask and presenting itself as good or as necessary? Our job is to unmask it. And in this regard, he taught us that we must listen to prophets and we must perhaps be prophets ourselves. And he told us that there's one lesson we learn from the Hebrew Bible, from the books of the prophets, above all others. And that lesson is, what's the difference between a true and a false prophet? A false prophet comforts you, and a true prophet disturbs you. We need to be unafraid to disturb those around us, and we need to be unafraid to be disturbed ourselves. This is a part of being a moral agent in the world. And the third question he asked us, the most important of all, is where are you, and what will you do with what you have learned? And this is a question he asked us many times at the end of class, at the end of the semester. What will you do with what you have learned here? Because everything we've learned needs to be put to use to make the world better. And students would often ask him, "Professor, we don't have a Nobel Prize. We don't have access to presidents and prime ministers. What are we supposed to do?" And he would often say, "Look for the outstretched hand. Look for someone in your immediate vicinity who needs your help, and do something, anything to help." It's not about scale. It's about consistency and purpose. We can make the world better through such consistency and through such purpose. At the end of the semester, as I told you, Professor Wiesel would open the floor to questions. And so at this point, this is now 2007, I had been Professor Wiesel's teaching assistant for several years, and I saw many, many students radically changed through their encounters with him in the classroom, but also in private conversations. I was very fortunate to have hundreds of private conversations with him, but he insisted that every student in his class meet with him at least once in the course of the semester. This was a very busy man, but he made time for meetings with every student in the class. That meant 70 or so students per semester, 10, 15-minute meetings minimum. Usually they went longer. And he met with every student to ask them something, ask them to ask him a question that they were carrying. And so at this point, I had seen many transformative moments, and I'd heard many of the students' questions. There were activists, there were ministry students, there were literature scholars, there were theater majors and visual artists. And they all said some version of the same thing to me at some point in our conversations. They said, I felt at that moment, I felt my future changing. And I could no longer just think about myself and my career. I had to do something for the world through whatever discipline I inhabit. But in 2007, at the end of the semester, the floor was open for questions again. And I have written of this, and I have told this story many times. And it's an important story to repeat nowadays, I think. The floor was open, and after several questions about current events, a student raised his hand and he asked, "Professor, can you show us the number on your arm?" There was a silence in the room. There was a sense of impending revelation. It wasn't clear how Professor Wiesel was going to react. But without a word, he took off his jacket, rolled up his sleeve, turned so that everyone could see the number on his arm, rolled his sleeve back, buttoned the sleeve, put his jacket back on, and he said, "Next question." And I have to tell you, I did not include this in my book, but it's important to know that there was a Holocaust denier that year who had written to Boston University faculty claiming that Elie Wiesel was never in the camps. A crazy person who had dedicated her life to this disgusting cause. So at that moment in the classroom, Professor Wiesel was deputizing every student in the class to be an agent of memory, to be able to say, "I saw the number on his arm. I was there." And as we have fewer and fewer survivors among us, and as we wonder who will tell the story, and as the role of second generation becomes more and more important, and third generation becomes more and more important, and as the role of Holocaust educators becomes more and more important, not only for the Jewish people and not only for the memory of the Holocaust itself, but for the future of our world. Because the Holocaust is two things at once. Professor Wiesel's favorite phrase was "and yet." He could hold two ideas together, and we're going to do that now. The Holocaust is two things at once. The Holocaust is uniquely and only about the Holocaust. The Holocaust is a unique event in all of human history. Nothing like it has ever happened before or since. Nothing is comparable to it, for many reasons that Professor Wiesel spoke about publicly in his role on the President's Commission of the Holocaust in the 70s, and in many, many other fora over the course of his life. The Holocaust is completely sui generis. It's completely unique and incomparable. And yet, the Holocaust is about everything. Our entire world is shaped by it. The way that we think about medical ethics today, the way that we think about immigration and refugees, the way that we must think about justice in all its forms, the way that we think about our role in identifying and fighting hatred in all its forms, all of that must be and is fundamentally defined by the experience of the Holocaust. Even if we're talking about something that is taking place in a completely different part of the world where people may not even know about the Holocaust has shaped our world and continues to. And so we forget it at our peril. And this is a universal task. And so as we have fewer and fewer survivors, who will tell the story? The response to this question, and it's a question that comes from the heart, it comes with pain and concern. And I hear this question from educators and people of good intent from many backgrounds across the globe. Who will tell the story? The answer, the response is in the story that I just told you, because Professor Wiesel believed very deeply that listening to a witness makes you a witness. To hear the story is to carry the story. To carry the story is to have a responsibility to tell the story. And the story only really becomes yours when you give it away. And so what are the stories that you carry? And is it possible for each of you and each of your communities and each of our communities across the globe to adopt one story of a survivor or one story of someone who did not survive? And in this way, to preserve memory and the power of memory and the power of empathy and moral activation to create a different and a better world. I want to end by sharing that in the last conversation I ever had with Professor Wiesel 3 weeks before he passed away, we spoke about many, many things. He gave me homework. He gave me tasks and a kind of gift of a legacy of requests and perhaps even commands to continue his work in various ways, which I'm trying to do now. The last words he said to me in that conversation, as I bent down to hold his hand, he was in a wheelchair. He was very, very frail. I didn't want to hug him because I was afraid I would hurt him, but he pulled me into an embrace and he kissed my cheek. And I started to stand up and he pulled me down again on the other side. He kissed my other cheek and he whispered two words to me. He whispered, "One more, one more." So he was talking about one more kiss on the cheek. But as we know in Jewish tradition and many traditions, the last words of a person, the last words we hear from a person matter. And I thought long and hard about what do these words mean? What is the message of Professor Wiesel to me and to us today? And what's the significance of the words "one more"? I think the answer is there's always one more thing we can do. There's always one more question we can ask. There's always one more step we can take. There's one more phone call to make. There's one more person to reach out to. There's one more moment of learning to share together. There's one more book to read. There's one more book to discuss. There's one more care package to bring to someone who's hungry. There's one more challenge we can pose to ourselves to take another move toward the world that we all yearn for. And as we face so many challenges today, the challenge of anti-Semitism in all its forms, the challenge of racism and economic injustices, questions, complex and thorny questions about war and conflict, oppression, genocide, even today, immigration, hunger, and homelessness, and the future of our Earth's health itself. All of these questions can be so overwhelming. And I speak to young people who are overwhelmed. We have to remember Professor Wiesel's last words to me. His message to us, I think, is one more. Find something, one next step, and take it. Thank you. I want to just share before we end that I wish I were able to be with you in person. I hope I'll be able to meet you all again. In the meantime, though, if you have a question or a thought that you'd like to share with me, feel free to email me. I will respond to you. It might take me some time, but I will. If you want to learn more about my current work, you can visit witnessinstitute.org, which is our project to carry on the legacy of Professor Wiesel. And I want to thank Lauren and the Gross Family Center for the opportunity to speak to you today. Be well, stay joyful, choose hope. Thank you.